Hi everyone, I'm Jessica Huang. I'm a member of the BlackRock Impact team. Everybody here probably knows Don Gould already, but he is the chair of the investment committee of Pitzer College. And really for today, what I want to do was spend the first 20-25 minutes discussing Pitzer College's journey for sustainable investing. So Barbara, if you could let us know when we have 5 to 7 minutes left, we kind of want to open it up for Q&A for the audience. Oh, George will tell us? Okay, great. So really, I think Pitzer had a pretty unique sustainable investment journey. You know, they went through the decision to divest from fossil fuels all the way to implementing an ESG policy, and then just very recently investing in a very new strategy that they co-created with us at BlackRock. So what I want to do is just first start off with some background. So in the spring of 2014, Pitzer College's Board of Trustees announced their decision to divest their entire $125 million endowment from fossil fuels. So this wasn't an overnight decision. It began with a student-led initiative in 2012 and 2013. So Don, can you tell us a little bit more of the process you and the board undertook to get to the decision to actually divest?
Sure. As you say, it started with a student initiative pushing for fossil fuel divestment. I was the incoming chair of the investment committee. I was sort of inherently protective of anything that seemed like an infringement on the committee's latitude in investing. But I spent the summer of 2013 really reading and thinking about it, and by the fall, I'd come to the conclusion that we really had to look into it in quite a bit more depth in order to reach a sound decision. Mm-hmm. And so the board created a working group which included not only trustees but also faculty, staff, and students so that we could get the broad range of community voices in on the topic. And by the spring of 2014, after many months of meeting, the working group came to the board with a recommendation which included fossil fuel divestment, but that was just one plank in a more comprehensive climate action plan. So that was kind of how we got to that step.
Great. So as you mentioned, the more comprehensive plan, can you really elaborate on that? Pitzer set out to establish an ESG policy. They created a fund that promotes sustainability, and they're targeting a reduction of 25% of the carbon footprint by the end of 2016. So why wasn't divestment from the endowment enough? Can you just tell us a bit more
Sure.
about all these other actions?
I think divestment created an opportunity for the college to do more than divestment. I think the board, in looking at the issue, felt that, and the working group felt that divestment was a necessary step, but not a sufficient step. And that, in fact, it shouldn't just be the board or the endowment that's got skin in the game, that this is an opportunity to get the rest of the community to make commitments. So the reduction of the carbon footprint from what was already substantially reduced, at least compared to, say, 2010, but to reduce it another 25% in 18 months, that was a big commitment. And then we also made the commitment to integrate ESG, which of course we'll be talking about. So yeah, I think that idea of shared commitment and skin in the game was a big factor.
Great. So the decision to divest, as you said, was made in early 2014, and you did actually fully divest from fossil fuel stocks by the end of that year. But in the summer of 2016, BlackRock, we were approached by Mercer, which was the consultant you were using at the time, to actually provide a new solution that integrates fossil fuel divestment and also ESG integration. So can you tell us a bit more about your partnership with Mercer, and also why didn't you just go with an off-the-shelf solution? Why not just an ex-fossil fuel?
Sure. If you step back a little bit, the divestment was relatively straightforward in 2014. We had maybe 6% of the portfolio in fossil fuel stocks. We were able to get rid of 5/6 of that by the end of 14, but it turned out that last percentage point would actually have required an awful lot of disruption to the portfolio. So there was that lingering issue, and then there was also the fact that, again, from an investment point of view, we didn't think divestment by itself was as holistic a solution as we could arrive at. And so we made this commitment in 2014 without actually having thought about how we would fulfill it, which was that we were going to integrate ESG at the same time. As you mentioned, Mercer's our consultant. We hired them in 2009. And frankly, at that point in time, responsible investment was not high on our radar. But we were really pleased to see the depth of expertise that they have in that area once it became something that we needed. So, it sounds simple, divest from fossil fuels, integrate ESG, but how do you do the two of those simultaneously? There were some suggestions that, well, one part of the portfolio can be divested, the other part can be ESG. Didn't seem like a very elegant solution. So we sat down with Mercer really with just a blank sheet of paper and sort of sketched out, all right, here's what we need to do. We need to start with a global equity universe that's ex-fossil fuels. So that's a starting point. Then we need to figure out how to optimize the remaining universe to get an ESG score in our portfolio that's substantially better than if we were simply just buying, say, MSCI ACWI or even ex-fossil fuels. But then we said, but it can't purely be maximizing ESG because you're introducing tracking error into the picture. And so we essentially gave them a tracking error budget and said, optimize subject to that constraint. And that's kind of the end result. To your question about off-the-shelf solutions, there wasn't one. That was the problem. And if there had been, that would have been great. But I think the beauty of our example is that the state of financial engineering is now such that a school like Pitzer, which is really very small compared to even a Pomona College or obviously a Stanford or Yale, that we're able to get a custom solution that fits our specific needs. And so that's what we've come up with. And that, as you well know, the fund actually launched early last month. Yeah. But we'll be announcing it next week. So you have inside information.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on that. I guess a question that comes up quite often is passive versus active. Was there a sort of decision making in when you're thinking about the endowment as to fully move it to passive solutions?
Yeah. When I joined the board about 12 years ago, the equities part of our portfolio was kind of a hodgepodge. Maybe 4 active managers, some mutual funds, some separate accounts, commingled. And these decisions had been made incrementally over time by different investment committees. There wasn't a lot of coherence to it. I've been a huge advocate, both in my professional life, as well as with Pitzer, of passive. I've been doing it for over 30 years. So for me, I've been kind of pushing Pitzer in that direction for many years. So this was kind of a logical extension of that. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question?
It was really just passive.
Why passive? Yeah. And obviously, with passive, we've managed to go from, say, 8 managers to 1. We have reduced our annual management expenses by $250,000 a year. That's a significant amount for us. We've vastly simplified the work of the investment committee. In my opinion, gotten us out of the weeds. We spent way too much time in the weeds. It was, well, do we fire this manager because so-and-so left the firm or because they underperformed for the last 3 years? Do we increase emerging markets from 4% to 4.5%? Those aren't the things that an investment committee should be spending their time on. And so this has also freed us up, I think, to focus on more important issues.
Great. What would you say are some of the biggest obstacles that you faced in deciding to exclude fossil fuels and also establishing the ESG policy? Was there pushback from others thinking that as a fiduciary, you really shouldn't be divesting from fossil fuel stocks?
The pushback really there wasn't much pushback within Pitzer. If there was a little pushback, it was probably from within my investment committee, because we're all sort of trained to instinctively resist anything that smacks of, restricting our latitude on what asset classes we use. But it wasn't a strong pushback. The much bigger pushback has been from sort of third-party observers, arguing that somehow this wasn't consistent with fiduciary duty. But that didn't seem to be a problem internally.
Got it. So I guess in terms of advice to other trustees or CIOs out there, are there any pieces of advice or anything, lessons learned along the way that you would want to share?
Well, I think the most important lesson, and it took me, a good 6 months to reach this conclusion, was that these kinds of decisions to, whether it's divestment or whether it's ESG integration, they usually end up being put upon the investment committee of the board, because on the surface it looks like an investment question. But I felt that wasn't really, wasn't fair to the investment committee, and it wasn't fair to the institution, because really this is a values-based decision that should be taken by the full board. If you don't get full board buy-in and the investment committee goes off and does this, you could have a serious problem. And conversely, if you let the investment committee veto it, you could end up having an investment policy that's not really aligned with the institutional values. So I think it was very important to get the whole board accountable for the decision. And I think the second thing that was really important, and particularly I think in higher education this is true, Pitzer strongly values a culture of shared governance. And so the fact that that working group had all the different constituencies represented on it was crucial to getting community buy-in.
Great. So one last question. So I have to mention that Pitzer's motto is Profita Futuri, which is mindful of the future. And I know you wanted us to name the fund after that. Unfortunately, BlackRock has very boring naming conventions for all of our funds, so we weren't allowed to use a Latin phrase. But knowing that sustainability is embedded in Pitzer's DNA, what is next for Pitzer? Is there anything else the endowment's thinking of doing? Is there anything else the campus is thinking of doing?
Sure. Well, with respect to the endowment, we have taken some small but meaningful steps toward impact investing, particularly on the private illiquid side of our portfolio. So we made a couple commitments in the last 2 years to funds that are investing in things like energy efficiency technology, renewable energy projects, sustainable agriculture, and so that's probably the newest thing on the horizon. At some point we've got to look at the fixed income side of the portfolio. We're not there yet. At some point we also have to think about where do some of these vehicles like hedge funds fit into the equation. So we're doing one thing at a time, but a lot of people faint or come close to fainting when we tell them that our entire public equities portfolio is now in a single global equity index fund. And that was a pretty big step for us.